Erasure Agitation, an interactive piece by artist Isabel Luterot. Her work stems from a forthcoming book about abolitionists John Brown and Frederick Douglass. The two of them were instrumental in shaping the course of American history and race relations as we know them today. Isabel provides a brief historical look back to a pivotal moment leading up to the American Civil War. Her work reflects on the past, captures the present, and ponders the future. Black Lives Matter has generated a discussion at the City College around not only Black lives, but all things that matter. In a conversation with students and professors, we examine the erasure of some pertinent figures in American history and the agitation movement #Black Lives Matter with artist Isabel Luterot, Professor Biz Lopez, and Mark Greenfeld.
Good, and it's going to get warm, so hopefully we'll just get all cozy. So the title of this work, titles are important since most of us are students. I think titles are important. Even if it's untitled, it's saying something. But I like to title things. So this work comes out of a book that I've been working on for a very long time. I work very slowly. You can still work slowly and have work that you produce. And so I started this work with really wanting to understand. I grew up outside of Maryland, outside of Baltimore, and I spent quite a bit of time on the eastern shore of Maryland and in Baltimore growing up. And it dawned on me that this is where Frederick Douglass grew up, and so I wanted to understand where was there a memory of him in the landscape. And so that begun this journey that I've been on for several years, coming to a decade, of really trying to understand the erasure or the presence of what is left. And so the title Erasure comes from that, in looking at the landscape and seeing that there have been parts that have been removed or have been lost over time, and whose narrative gets lost and why was important to me. And for this particular project, it was the narrative of Frederick Douglass. And then in doing so, John Brown has always been this important person that I went to Harper's Ferry as a child, and his story was always couched in him being this radical fanatic who did this act of insanity. And so I was like, well, who is this guy? Who is he? What did he do? And why do people think of him this way? And so in going back and really unpacking who he was and understanding who he was, I was interested in how his narrative has been couched, but two, how there's also been this erasure of who he was. And in my eyes, how that has helped to feed a certain narrative around him. And so the word agitation is, in a way, a tip of the hat to his agitation, often brutal and violent, but his agitation, thinking of Harper's Ferry and that act of his final act of rebellion, which in a way was 18 months before the Civil War started. And the word agitation also comes from the conversation that a Howard University student, Howard University is a historically African-American college located in Washington, D.C., and Frederick Douglass, very close to realizing that the most important person who had been around for nearly a century. He was born in 1818, he died in 1895, he was around for a very important part of American history. Realizing that this mentor, that this guide was about to die, a Howard University student interviewed him and said, how do we continue the cause? How do we keep the cause going? And his words were agitation, agitation, agitation. And so that's where agitation comes from, is that idea of the mosquito in the bedroom, the constant need for there to be movement in order for something to break through. And that became became sort of these powerful words of understanding that time in history, and that the power behind the abolitionist movement, the need for agitation. And in thinking about putting together something for this space, I've really been sitting with for a long time what has been happening over the course of, let's say, the last year, in looking at the highlighted cases of different very brutal interactions with police and African American and also Latinos. Primarily the focus in the media has been on African Americans, but it's certainly something that's happening throughout a lot of different communities. And so I went back to this book, and I thought, well, there has to be something here that echoes this. And these two quotes really stood out in being able to, for me, echo what is this other time, I think this is 1859, this is 1858, like echo what, over 150 years ago, and realize how poignant it was for this time where we are. And how tragic it was in the same regard. So the hashtag Black Lives Matter is because this is sort of an addition of erasure and agitation. And that within the context of Black Lives Matter and that movement and what's happening behind it, and more so what that means, these kind of have these quotes resonate in a very particular way. And that felt important to realize that people say history repeats itself, and how do we grow from it, rather than continually going back into it. So in bringing it, and kind of also thinking about how this relates, I thought about, well, if Black Lives Matter, then do something. Like, if Black Lives Matter, then say something. What is that action that we can all possess? What is the opportunity that we all have to be active, to be agitators in the movement in whatever capacity that we can be? Not everyone's going to go marching on a street, but we all have this capacity to do something. What is it? And so that, and being here at a school, what is it? So that's where you guys being able to be part of it becomes an important part. And I haven't looked at what everyone's written, but I'm certainly going to keep all the Post-it notes for reference. So that's my prologue.
You know, I was struck when I was looking at these. I was thinking about, I'm a student of history. I've always been fascinated with history. And when I first saw this, my tendency was to reimagine the genesis of the civil rights movement. A lot of people attribute the civil rights movement to something that happened, that began in the 50s. But in reality, I think it began with these people, with the abolitionists in many ways. And I was just wondering, in going to these different locations, did you have a sense of pilgrimage? What did you feel? What did you feel psychologically by these places?
Okay, that's a great question. All of these photographs that I took, and I took, I don't know, maybe 40 rolls plus of medium format film, 6x9 and 2 1/4. So you don't get that much out of a roll. And you don't know what you're getting out of the roll until you develop it. And these were all shot over Thanksgiving weekend and going home for winter holiday. And I say that because that's why they look so bare. Because the tree, there's no leaves on the tree, everything looks very stripped down. And I photographed just about all of them around 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. So it was very early in the morning, and to get to some of these sites, particularly this one, I had to leave the house at 4 in the morning, because this was shot in eastern Maryland, and my parents live 2 hours away. And so just going there and driving to these different sites, it was sort of like I was getting ready for what an experience would be. And when I started this project and I wrote to the Historical Society in Eastern Maryland, and I said, what is there about Frederick Douglass? And the response was, here's a driving tour you can take. I thought, oh, okay. He's only the most important person that was born in your county, in your area. And all you have is a driving tour. Okay. Now the one thing, to be fair to them, and this is back in the early 2000s, so the one thing that they do have, that they put up in the 70s or 60s, that sort of looks like a historic marker, they have, on one side of a bridge, they have this marker to Frederick Douglass, a Negro patriot who served his country, blah, blah, blah. And then when I went back 7, 8 years later, they put one on the other side of the street. So on both sides, you can see that. And in the book, you see, I have both of those photographed. But I couch all of it, I couched my response with all of that because it was an experience to go to these places. At 5 in the morning to show up, you don't know who's driving on the streets. And these are rural areas. This is a very rural spot. And to be out there with my camera, with my tripod, was an intense experience. And to look into this landscape and to know somewhere in that hinterland, I don't know where, because all they say is, this is the spot where Frederick Douglass was born. That's where Frederick Douglass was born, in his grandmother's cabin, and he lived for 6 years before being taken to the big house to be a slave at the age of 6. That's what happened somewhere in there. And that's a very profound experience to have at 6 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning.
So the cabin's not there anymore?
Cabin's gone.
Big house isn't there anymore?
It's morphed. The land has changed because of development, but yeah. And so for this one, this was done very early in the morning too. And I have a photograph in the book that shows literally the sun rising above the tree line. This was done in Sharpsburg, Maryland. And I'm standing on the road photographing this house, which is the Kennedy farm. It's called the Kennedy farm because of the owner of the property. And obviously you can't enter, it's all gated up, but you can walk around it. And it's very rural. We're about 6-7 miles from Harper's Ferry. And it's like 5 in the morning. It's really cold. It's really cold, bone-chilling cold. And like a pickup truck goes by. And I'm like, okay, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. I have that confidence around me, like it's gonna be okay. And I'm photographing these shots, and I photographed the entire property. And the importance of this site is that this is where, under the alias Isaac Smith, John Brown rented this property and trained his militia at night because he didn't want to raise suspicion from the neighbors by training during the day. And he had women on site who were his daughters to help cook and clean, so it looked like it was less aggressive or not to raise attention. So there were women milling around. And that's where he launched his raid, using a militia comprised of both black and white men. And so to be there that early in the morning, knowing all of the things that transpired, knowing that several months earlier he had had a conversation at a quarry on a free black man's property in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, asking Frederick Douglass to join him in the raid, knowing that Frederick Douglass said, no, this is an ill-fated plan, it's not going to work, and denied and said he wasn't going to be part of it, knowing that no sooner had this taken place and John Brown been hanged no sooner did the raid take place and it was put down by General Robert Lee. No sooner was he hung, No sooner did the Civil War start, all of these different things transpired. You start to see this interesting conversation happen where Frederick Douglass, who was a big supporter of John Brown, starts to use what happened there as this, and Du Bois kind of writes about it too a little bit. It becomes this like important moment in American history, and different speeches. They used to celebrate the end of the Civil War. They used to celebrate emancipation. So for several years after the emancipation of African Americans, there were huge celebrations that would happen in D.C. and in different places. That's gone. But Frederick Douglass would give speeches, and would give fiery speeches about the problems with the fact that things were moving fast enough and that things were regressing.
Can I just really quickly, do you mind?
Because you can't stand in a place like that, knowing the history that I was beginning to piece together, and not feel the importance of like, I'm gonna ford that river myself, you know, or just sort of like, wow, this is a powerful moment in American history, in all of our history. And realize the weight of history as you're standing there. It was powerful.
Is there anything in the process that just like what probably was maybe the most surprising thing, or is this the most powerful thing that happened in the investigation of that book? And then I also think of like the book and then this coming out of that. Like your thoughts just through the whole development of that, or whatever you choose.
Yeah. I think what was in making the book, it was really incredible the conversations that I would have with people. And when I start a project, or when I started this project, I let people kind of direct me, or I didn't go with an agenda, and I didn't go with judgment. So people said things that were pretty incredible and sounded a little crazy, to be honest. And in the book I kind of document some of that. It's not necessary for this, but for the book it is, because how people spoke about, for instance, when I went into one historical site and I said, "Ooh, what do you have about Frederick Douglass?" I was redirected to looking at plantation homes in Baltimore. I thought, that's not really what I want. So it was interesting to see that and to experience that. For this, I think what's so powerful is to be able to see that people have participated and that people are part of it, and that the words by Frederick Douglass are something that we can all take and hold within ourselves, and that it becomes something that we can. It becomes something that we can have ownership on, rather than feeling, and we can feel empowered within rather than the opposite. And that becomes the exciting part about taking this history and bringing it forward to where we are right now. And it was an experiment, you know. So I'm like, does this work? Does it work? You know, these are two stories that are very close to me, and that I'm very that are close to me, that I feel very close to. But I wanted to share it because I felt like this is something that we're not reinventing the wheel. Like, the wheel's there. It's actually been happening for a long time, and I think the more we know about what has happened before, the more we understand how much we can really shape and change it.
You know, a few years ago, we were all kind of enamored with this notion that we had reached an era of post-blackness. Given what's been happening, do you think that that was premature?
Well, I think in order to reach a post, you have to have gone through. There are a lot of steps, and there's a lot of steps that. There are a lot of steps that need to happen for there to be a level of enlightenment in general. So no, we're not at post anything. We're in it.
I contend that we're hyper. I think we've reached an era of hyper-racialism, if anything else. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity.
So define what you mean by hyper-racialism.
I think that, at this point, everybody is so focused on race much more so even during the civil rights movement. Because I think at this point we're rooting out those evils in society that have existed under the surface, that have been more or less camouflaged. And I think everybody's acting out in ways that are very revealing.
Yeah.
I agree with that, and I think that where you see that is sort of in the Confederate flag conversation. I think you see that in why do we have these statues to Jefferson and the Confederate soldiers who lost? That's an active conversation in parts of America. And I think it's been a long time since those conversations have been actually talked about outside of sort of a living room or dining room table. So yeah.
And I think it's a very good thing, quite
Yeah.
frankly. I think that this is the part of the civil rights movement that we haven't dealt with. That I think at this point in time we are dealing with it. And I think I'm very optimistic with regards to what's going to happen in the next generation.
And I think we are able to deal with it because there's been a crack, and because we have this opening in looking at issues around, because there's this multitude that's happened where we have issues around gay rights that are on the table, we have issues around trans rights, we have issues around a lot of different people who have been squelched, and so I think that's the crack that's happening, and that is allowing for these other deeper conversations to be had. I don't know if we could have those without the other. I think they do go hand in hand.
Can we talk about Black Lives Matter and at the same time talk about all life matters? Or should we be talking about that? Should we be singling those things out?
I think there's a need to drill down deeply in a singular way before we look at all lives matter. And I think that there's a need to have a focus on Black Lives Matter, Latino Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter, because it allows for there to be a focus on something that hasn't had that singular focus. I think for me, in a way, the obvious thing is that all lives matter. But what is not obvious is that sometimes sometimes we don't understand why something like Black Lives Matter or Trans Lives Matter or
Well, we're looking at it through the lens
Yeah.
of our own experience.
Exactly. I think we've missed that point, that why those are important, because we haven't looked at them, and exactly, we're looking them through the prism of our own experience, and that's why it's important for someone to own it and to share what that experience is.
Because if all lives matter, then we wouldn't really need to have all other matters, because it would just be everybody be taken care of.
Right.
And yet it's like, that's
That's
not
not
what's
the
happening.
case.
So-
Exactly.
And then I know, certainly people linking Black Lives Matter with, attacks on police and trying to, again, kind of like what happened with Occupy, where it's like dismiss it as a bunch of radicals and people just making all kinds of crazy statements, a la, forget about John Brown, he was just some crazy terrorist.
Mhm.
But then it's like, what to do to not let them sort of co-opt this sort of demonize and make Black Lives Matter into something that's bad and something that we should be afraid of, as opposed to embracing what can engender more discussion.
Exactly, and I think that's a responsibility, that's not one person's responsibility, it's all of our responsibilities. As it is my responsibility to think of why, and to be reflective of why, and I'll keep going back to this, why trans lives matter. It's my responsibility to think of why Latino lives matter, it's my responsibility to think of all of those, as it is all of our responsibilities to think of why those matter. I believe in the ability for there to be a collective consciousness that will allow for change to happen. And it is rosy, but it may be a little Pollyanna, but I think it happens through us being in conversation with each other. And it happens with us turning to someone who's standing in line and saying, "How are you?" And not being on our phone. I'm on my phone all the time. But I think we have these moments where we can connect with people. And we can choose to reach out to someone who looks very different from us and say, how are you? How's your day? And and just to hear what they have to say. And it's amazing when I do that, I walk away feeling so much better about myself than I did before I did that. And I think those are the moments that I take. Those are the moments that are allow us to build this collective consciousness of caring about each other and caring about people in our neighborhood and caring about people in our families and caring about people who aren't in our families. And I talk about it and then I'm like, well, you can't just talk about it, you have to do it. And so I do it. And baby steps, I'm trying. It's like I'm an introvert, so it's hard for me to always, but I do it. And I try to reach beyond myself and to talk with people who I would never go up and say hello to them. Or I would never make a point of connecting. Because when we connect, then we're able to expand ourselves. And that's part of recognizing the human and the human within each of us. And we lose that. We lose that when we lose that. And in many ways, it's something that I think it's nice to think it's something that existed before. Like, oh, so much better in the 60s, or so much better at the. But I think it's something that that existed and didn't exist in each generation. I don't think we can say it was once, because there were other circumstances that allowed for things to not necessarily be that rosy for everyone.
The very forces that you're arguing, like us coming together, just interacting with one another, just done like, hey, how's it going, how's your day, actually teaches us that we have all these things in common, rather than certain people don't like that we have things in common, and that we can just extend and not think about anything else, except that we're human. Because once that happens, we have that coalition building, we're just seeing each other, with everybody mattering, and that becomes terrifying for some people. And
Yeah.
have to like try and separate us again.
Yeah.
But like with this in particular, when I came to the show, it's like I want to thank you for what it's actually, like activating the space. Because then we've had the opportunity in our classrooms to talk about this. And I take little polls, like who knows who Frederick Douglass is, who knows who John Brown is, and sometimes there's like one person. And it's like, well, why is that? Right? And so it's been really great to be able to talk about and bring that history back and then try and get it back.
Oh, good. Frederick Douglass was an amazing man. I mean, he was a feminist. He spoke about being a feminist and gave fiery speeches at women's conventions. Before it was cool to. I mean, he's a hero of mine, and there are not many people who can show this arc of having, in his life, he writes about, and he has several different autobiographies, but he writes about what it was like to be a slave and the horrors of it. And obviously he started to learn how to read by one of his in Baltimore, with the guidance of one of his mistresses, the slave master's wife. Then that was taken away, and then he tricked people to teach him how to read, kids in the street. And then he started reading. And then it's like he has this incredible arc, and towards the middle of his life, he goes back to one of the men who owned him as a slave and forgives him. He writes about it in his book, and what he says to the and he has this, there are a few things that they talk about, and the slave master's on his deathbed, and it's a very profound moment of what, and he was criticized for forgiving his slave master, heavily criticized. But it's also this incredible moment of where we all have that capacity to be forgiving and to ask for forgiveness. And what does that mean where we are in our lives? What does that mean as a teacher? What does that mean as a student? What does that mean as who you are and who I am? And that just gave me the shivers. I was like, wow, that's really deep. That's really, really deep, that this man found it in himself to do that to someone who was a cruel jerk. Yeah. It kind of blows my mind.
And I guess also the notion of forgiveness, that's the only way to heal in some, not the only, but one of the ways for us to heal all of these conditions, if we can find, and it's so hard, somebody shoots your child or, takes away your life, it's like how do people around you do that?
And for the people who do, I have so much admiration. When I hear about, when I hear about sort of a tragedy happening, then people are able, after a long period of time, to find forgiveness within themselves, and it's genuine, and it's also it's part of their process of healing. It's inspiring. I mean, it's inspiring. I read or I heard the critique by Coates, who talked about he was interviewed by Terry Gross on Fresh Air when he talks about the black parishioners forgiving the shooter in South Carolina, and he was like, oh, it's a local move. It was of course they had to, blah, blah. And I don't know where I started that, but I found that was an interesting way of looking at it. Not saying that he was right or wrong, but I'm just still trying to sift through how I feel about that, because that was. Did you see that? Did you hear that? Yeah, it was an interesting interview. Terry Gross usually has anyway, but it was an interesting interview, and it was interesting to see how he spoke about what had happened in South Carolina, and he was obviously talking about his new book that had just come out as well, The Letters to the Sun. But I'm conflicted. I'm trying to figure it out too, and I figure it out through my work.
Which is what most artists do.
Yeah.
Who is he and what is his moral authority to talk about those families in South Carolina?
Coates.
What?
Tanish.
Yeah.
He was being asked the question by Terry Gross. So he was responding as he writes for The Atlantic.
Right.
He was responding as someone as a lot of people have responded. Yeah. I don't think he wasn't responding from a place of he was giving his opinion. Yeah.
Do we want to open it up for questions?
Sure.
I don't know if you heard about the backlash.
Tell me about the backlash.
I guess I just remember her first name. I believe it was Renee. I guess she's a soap opera actress, and was saying, "Why didn't you include all women instead of just, why did you focus so much on black women?" Which is almost echoing what's going on with All Lives Matters versus Black Lives Matters in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the fallout of what
She later apologized.
of Viola said. Okay. I think it's a profound statement that we're in 2015 and we are celebrating the first African American woman winning an Emmy. I think that's enough said. Yeah. I'm waiting for the first Asian woman, the first Latino woman, the first Native American woman. Let's get all these firsts out of the way and have it be part of the cycle. Right. So it's not such a, why is it 2015? That just seems, that gets me every time, like, what year is it again? I am 2015. Wow.
And would you have to respond to those who, like those who say all lives matters, and why is it such a big deal for black or any other race to be the first in anything? Would you have to respond to that? Because the understanding is this whole issue
embrace that when what we've been through has shaped a perceived notion on maybe stereotypes or what life is like, or some of the inner and external things we deal with. How do we got to trust with each other? Because some of us might be the same race but have a different upbringing, and it could just benefit if it was some type of medium, I guess. So I don't know if it's a question or just want to kind of.
Well, it's a bit, I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified to necessarily answer that. I think that it takes individuals. I think it's hard to think of things in terms of groups, or like, if everyone just did this, or if everyone just did that. I think it takes the individual, and you saying within yourself, this is what is gonna be my guidepost, this is how I'm choosing to, this is the choice I make to live my life. Because that's all we can control, is how we choose to engage. And when we see, when people engage us in another way, then we have an opportunity to allow them to understand how that impacts us.
Can I ask you a question? How do you self-identify?
With myself and others. I like to self-identify myself as being omnipresent, trying to just take in all perspectives, all angles, all, you know. But I do get rejection at times. I leave myself vulnerable. I am the one saying, "How you doing?" And my generation is looking like, you know, it's like, you know, I'm getting the game from my elders, and somebody got to have a voice. Can everybody just be growing up and, you know, it can't just be on y'all to just open up, you know. It's okay to take it back home and innovate ideas and create ideas, and, you know, that's good. But it also takes us continuing to live within that realm of what really matters.
Do you feel you've been profiled at all?
Identity, because I feel like that in the U.S., especially in large cities, identity there's a complexity of mix going on, and that through media there's always this talking about one or the other. And I feel like the transgender community has really brought this into the fore. Like, what is identity? What does that mean? Does it mean, it always seems to be in I mean, other countries might have different ways of dealing with it, but one, skin color seems to be the thing where people really focus on as far as identity. And I feel like there's just so many people that have such a mixed identity, whether it's having parents of different cultural backgrounds, racial backgrounds, being raised in the U.S., but having parents from another country, you know, how one identifies oneself as an American versus not, you know, also having this other language that and culture that they're dealing with. And I don't know, I guess the question is, like, ultimately, in what ways do you think this idea of identity might be changing, or that needs to be opened up much broader? And even the way Obama's spoken about it, I feel like that there's a kind of dishonesty of who he is as an individual and his background. It's always kind of focused on one element or another, but not really talking about it as the complexity of a mix of all kinds of upbringing.
I think we have to give credit to evolution. And maybe the type of utopian society that we're looking at will happen in another few centuries. But I can guarantee you, if we all woke up tomorrow morning and we were blonde and blue-eyed, by 12 noon, we'd find one reason or another to discriminate.
Well, there are those individuals in the world that, unfortunately, I was just thinking about when you were talking about Frederick Douglass, like, forgiving his slave owned him, youngster, and that there are always those individuals that have, I mean, well, psychologists would say they have a missing piece, right? in their empathy, ideas of empathy, engagement, and I think of course with that, well, I guess medical science and maybe evolution and that too can move the whole human race forward in certain ways.
I think, we're at such an interesting time in history where people are able to fully acknowledge sort of what their heritage might be or the complexity behind it. And I'm biracial, and I had a family reunion in Germany, in Leipzig, Germany, and I met I met descendants who were German for the first time, and there were family members from all different continents, and my family is spreads across 3 different continents. And so, one of the people who was there, and we all have the same name, Lugerod, with a little alteration in Germany. Most of them are Lugerods. And so, one of my relatives stood up and he said, at the hotel, they were very confused, and one of the people at the hotel counter, check-in counter, he was like, you're white, and then they're black, and they speak German and English, and like, what is this family? And he's like, it's the new wave, and he said, we are that, and it was so curious to, it was such an interesting moment, for me to be there amongst relatives who I see myself in the family tree and where we fit in, and to be in that space where we all share the same ancestor. And eventually it would be wonderful to be able to do a movie about it because it's really wild. But to be able to have that space where we share the same ancestor, we're all incredibly different, and we span all these different continents, and what does it mean? I mean that it was very touching to hear him say hearing him say, oh, this is fantastic because this is it. This is the new wave. And then of course you hear about this was in late August, and by a week later, there's a huge flood of Syrians coming through Eastern Europe into Germany. How terrific is it? Because Europe is slowly, really, really having to change and kind of look at what that means. What does it mean to be Danish? What does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be English? And when people say English, what do you picture in your head? And is that really what an English person looks like now? I think those are all part of the conversation that we can each carry forward. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that these are interesting places to see where our worlds intersect and connect. And certainly, one of the things that was missing when I was growing up, or sort of came in at the tail end of when I was growing up, was sort of people really acknowledging what it meant to be biracial, as opposed to just saying, I'm black, or I'm this, or I'm that. And I know at Brown University they started a mixed kids group, which I always thought I was like, wow, that's interesting. But I think we all hold the space to be able to have these conversations. It's not this is only for this person, this is only for this person. It's for us to all be part of that.
I don't think most people want to express themselves until it happens to them firsthand. Until then is when everyone opens up. That's based on experience. Because I've been profiled, especially in the Culver City area, just because of how I look. I'm bald. I started losing my hair at the age of 18, so if I take it, I'm like, oh, okay, it makes sense. But if you were just seeing me in the street, it's like, oh, he's probably a tagger, it's up to no good. So it's like I opened up because I can relate to just about every topic, what everyone said. And until something happens to you is when you feel the need to take action. I think that's how everyone is.
I wanted to ask, how do you, as a person with like radical conscious thought, and when you're what you were saying earlier about how it's important to build community and start coalitions with individuals that you're interacting with. It's like, if you're saying hi to someone and then they say hi back, and once you start conversating, they say something that you're so fueled by like the system of oppression. How do you like counteract with that? Do you feel like it's your job to help them come to consciousness, or do you feel like, no, like I don't have to deal with this and be in this space right now? Like, I think that's really, really important as people who are radical, that they have to like recognize, like, is this my place to educate, or is this my place to just walk away, because
Yeah.
it's super triggering.
Yeah.
And it's really, really, really unfortunate that decolonization is looked down upon by several people.
Yeah.
And as a person who identifies as queer, trans, and a person of color, it's really hard for me to be in spaces at times because everyone says something with like, it's like loaded. Like someone says something racist and doesn't even realize it's racist. And it's kind of like, so I'm sitting there like, am I the only person in this room with any conscious thought and realization that what is going on is like fuel because of the systems of oppression? It's so frustrating. Anyways, how do you like, what do? Do you like practice self-care and just like walk away, or do you try to like assimilate into consciousness?
Well, I think you pick your battles. I think there's some that you're willing to stand, you're willing to say something about because you feel safe. And there are other times where you're like, you know what, I'm gonna walk away and take care of myself right now. So you pick your battles, what you can choose, what you feel like where you feel you wanna do something. And I think that I was in a program, and one of the things that they spoke about was asking open, honest questions. And I think if you come from sometimes when you come from a place of just saying, oh, can you tell me more about that? Why do you think that way? Why do you feel people might think like just being able to have someone explain and asking questions that allow for them to hear themselves and keep going into it can be a very powerful tool. And you may never change their mind at that moment, but you don't know what seed you're going to plant. And it's a cumulative effect sometimes, where you've said something, someone else says something, someone else says something, and then there's this change that happens. And I'll use my mother as an example, because she's 75. And she had an employee whose child came out and said that she was gay, and then came out and said, actually, I'm trans. And I remember having conversations with my mother, and she was kind of like, first she's done this, and then she's done this, and her poor child, and her poor mother, and the effects is so. And my mother was really like struggling to figure out like, what does it mean to be trans? Like, I don't know. And she can see how her employee is really going through, is just really having a meltdown, and was really literally had a meltdown, had a breakdown. Was raised in a very religious family, and all these things are compiling, and my mother's really struggling to figure it out. And she's so young. Why is she transitioning? And then it's like, maybe, there's another way of. So there were these layers of conversation that my mother had with the woman who was her employee, had with me, and I said, well, so there were these layers of conversation. And then my mother tells me of when she was back in England with her daughter, her sister, and her sister's son was there with his daughter. And the daughter said, oh, there's this funny thing that happened at school where we got a letter that said Mr. Smith now had to be called Mrs. Smith when they returned to school. And, isn't this, yeah. What do we get, this is, ha ha ha, now there are two Mrs. Smiths, how are we going to know, between who's who? And my mother said, where does Mrs. Smith work? Oh, she works in the library. Then you say you want Mrs. Smith who works in the library. And to see this trajectory of my mother being at a place where she was now actually like correcting someone in her family, I got the shivers. I was like, okay, it is possible, but it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and it takes someone seeing the person struggle. So it's about being vulnerable, but it also takes multiple people talking about it. you know? And it went from it being, haha, this is something funny, to like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. And it just neutralized the whole situation.
Douglas, I mean, it's his life more in the area because, you know, it's such a large black community in the DMV area. So I lived in, I didn't even know about that. He lived that close to me.
Where did you say? You grew up in?
Leesburg, Virginia.
Oh, okay.
And Upper Marlboro.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't even, like I said, I didn't even know about it. It's 15 minutes away from Harper's Ferry.
Erasure.
Okay. Makes
That's
sense.
the erasure. You know, I went on field trips to Baltimore. We went to see Edgar Allan Poe's house, we went to the catacombs, we went to all these different places. We never heard about Billie Holiday growing up in Baltimore, and we never heard about Frederick Douglass growing up in Fells Point in Baltimore. It's erasure. It's erasure of that history. You're a testament to it then. And then you have to go out and seek it out yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Definitely.
That's how that happens. And that's a very interesting part. The Mid-Atlantic area is very interesting because the border goes right through it. The Mason-Dixon line kind of creates a certain boundary. I don't know. It's very interesting, curious part of America because of those.
And like even like my own family, my family's Mexican ancestry, and I didn't learn about Mexican artists till I was in high school. And my mother grew up in Guadalajara where you have these really famous Mexican muralists, and then I come home and I ask her, she's like, oh yeah, those guys. So why didn't you ever tell us about it? It never occurred to her that it was important, because when she got here, it wasn't really reinforced to be important. And so sometimes these very important histories, it's like right here. And then of course, there's the reason. It's like if we, like which heroes do we choose to commemorate? And why? Because some are threatening. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Even like with John Brown, I was reading about how in a way, perhaps his rebellion, like eventually perhaps they were moving toward in that direction, but his way was like just really almost like a guerrilla style, if that my understanding is correct, like that's what he hoped for. Instead, if the government did it, then they could manage to sort of unfold, and economically it might not hurt the whole system, because I think that's part of it too.
And he knew for him, it was, the system had to be disrupted. That's why there was this bloody Kansas, where he went to, where he went and fought pilgrims who were entering into the hinterland of Kansas and trying to settle. And he went and he and his militia destroyed all of those communities. He wanted to start a rebellion, and what he hoped was by taking over the arsenal in Harper's Ferry, the freed blacks who lived in Harper's Ferry and in the surrounding area would rise up with him. And I think what happened also, there were mistakes that he made, and one of them was a train came through Harper's Ferry. They stopped it, they boarded it, they looked through it, and then they let the train go. And so the train at the next stop told everyone something was happening in Harper's Ferry, which is what alerted Governor Wise, and all of that stuff happened. But I think, so that was one fatal mistake he made, but the other was not understanding perhaps a mindset of that it's hard to overcome if you don't know where you are. I mean, for the people who, it's hard to disrupt a status quo if you're also kind of, what is your benefit within it? And so his idea that the freed black men in Harper's Ferry would rise up and would help out in the rebellion was failed, it was flawed, it wasn't gonna happen. Because there was a benefit for them to kind of maintain a certain status quo. It was hard to disrupt the system. It was hard to push against the system. And I think that speaks to what it means to be on that edge of pushing against any system, and how do you know that the person who's on that front line is brave, but perhaps you don't understand the ramifications of it. For John Brown and his crew, the ramifications were death. That, I mean, it was an important trial and an important way of suppressing a rebellion as a way of making a statement, and that's what they hoped would happen. And the letters, while John Brown was in prison, there were letters that went back and forth to the governor to pardon him from abolitionists. The entire raid was sponsored through money from the North and Southerners, and some of them gave quite a bit of money to help support it. And there were lots of people writing back and forth. And I don't have there were some really interesting quotes I found that people had sent the governor to really ask them what, to really question his decision in the trial and going through this process, and really questioning the support of the defense of slavery. But it's something worth looking at, because I think oftentimes in reading it, you hear these echoes that allow for us to continue, that you hear echoes of ways that we continue to maintain sort of a status quo as well. It's profound writing, because that's what people did. They wrote letters. They literally, that's how they communicated. They wrote lots of letters, and letter writing became a sort of critical way of getting your ideas out and being able to communicate to people. And letters were like, what, 10, 12 pages long? So that's what you did. That's how you, that's how you stayed in touch. But
You guys are all questioned out?
Question now?
I'm happy to hear that you brought up language right now, because most of the people that are here are visual artists, and I think that you cannot underestimate the power of language. And you were talking earlier about the changing face of Europe with the Syrian influx. And I was thinking that there was a term, I'm considerably older than most of the people in the room, but there was a term that was very common when I was growing up, and that was America is a melting pot. You never hear that anymore. I don't know when the last time it was that I heard that, and I think now more than ever, it's really true, and it's especially true here in Los Angeles. And I mean, I don't know what to make of that, but I think that the more intercultural mixing there is that's going on, I think the less we are aware of it.
I've always thought Appomattox was a truce. I don't think that the Civil War was ever resolved in many ways.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
And I think that, there's part of the country that subscribes to the idea that this should be the melting pot that we all dreamed of. And there's another part that says, no. No. And if they could, they'd reinstate slavery.
And we're hearing that in the debates right now, too.
And then some argue that.
And in a way, they may be reinstating slavery by keeping everybody at a minimum wage that isn't enough to survive on.
or having a population who has come through a penal system who are never going to be able to vote. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can look at it. I think there is something to be said for America having lived with, instead of a melting pot, I always prefer the analogy that, and I'm gonna forget his name, he's a African-American filmmaker. He was an African-American filmmaker. They're showing some of his stuff at
Michelle?
At Pacific Design Center. Boca is.
Michelle?
Marlon
Riggs.
What?
Marlon Riggs.
Yeah, Marlon Riggs. He talks about it in terms of being like a gumbo pot, where everything has its like, there are all these different things that are needed. They don't disintegrate.
Right, they maintain their identity.
They maintain their identity within this milieu. So his movie is Black Is, Black Ain't. It's a fantastic film. If you guys can watch it, it's fantastic. It was a real eye opener to watch it. But and I was like, that's I like that analogy, the idea of it being a big pot of gumbo. And America's had to be in it in a way, this is true and it isn't true, but America has had to be in it for a lot longer than Europe has. And the way it's not true is when you look at some of the slave port cities like Manchester and Liverpool in England, and they've had people from different places living there. There's a huge Chinese community in Liverpool, obviously people from the different parts of the diaspora. But America's been in it for longer. And when I was studying in England, I always thought there's a lot for Europe to learn from America in terms of how not to do things, and in terms for how they could actually see this is, if you do this, you will get this. Like, this is the result you'll get. So why don't you do this and go down this path? I kind of think a lot of the issues that Europe will continue to deal with comes out of a need to preserve comes out of fear, obviously, but it comes out of fear of having to change. And that's not just true for Europe, it's true for any monolithic society. The fear of changing is very real. And it's how we choose to move through that is what allows us to grow as a community, as a society. But America is a wonderful test case, and there are places where it's been done where things have come to a place of this is where we're at, and there are things to still grow, and there are things that have yet to be uncovered and discovered, and that continues to unfold as different people, different immigrants, different generations come to grow up, so to speak.
We're seeing more and more of these shamanistic qualities in people where they can open up and integrate more into themselves, and there's less of this sort of segmentation like you versus me, or like people who look like me versus people who look like you. Do you think we're headed towards this opening, or are we just sort of hoping that the right open-minded people get into positions of power so that they can kind of shepherd us all in the right direction?
You want to really go down there? We could be here all night.
Yeah, nothing happens overnight. I think if you hope for the right people to get in office, you're going to be hoping a long time. I think it takes agitation. Nothing. I mean, that's why those words are so profound to me, because nothing's going to happen unless you're out there making it happen. You can't rely on someone. I mean, I'm a new votee. I got my citizenship in '06, and so Obama was the first president I voted for, and that was a very profound moment for me to be able to do that. But you got to show up, and that's true for you professionally as an artist. It's true for you as a professional in whatever field you go into. It's true for you as a citizen of this country. It's true if you're not a citizen of this country. It's true in whatever thing you do. You got to show up. And that's what I tell my interns when they were working for me. I said the first rule of thumb: show up. Because 99% of the time, someone is not going to show up, and you'll be the first one there. So if you want to change something, you got to show up. You got to be the one who's creating the change that you want. So I mean, and that's easier said than done, but it means voting. The population of folks who are between the age of 18 and 30 has a huge ability to create a lot of change. We saw that in Obama's first election. It was that age group that shifted the tide. I think that was what made the work that Brittany Newsom did. I knew her when she was Brittany. She was my sister's best friend's sister. But when Brittany went up the pole to get, with the help of the young man to get the flag down, she was showing when people decided to protest in front of South Carolina's court, legislature, talking about how to bring this, people were showing up. So, I mean, that's the, you know, when Cesar Chavez decided he was gonna fight for labor rights, he showed up. You know, the people you're talking about showed up, and they're not special because of it, it's because they showed up. And you can too. But you just have to show up.
Glad I showed up tonight.
There you go. I don't think there's anything that makes one person more special than the other, except for their ability to do something, and then we put them in this category. It could easily be you, you know, it could easily be you. But it's just, you decide to show up and do something, and then you get 10 of your friends to show up with you, and they bring 10 of their friends, and those friends bring 10 of their friends, and then you have a party who can actually do something.
Maybe I'll look at it. I'm not even a part.
And that's what made what Bree did so important, because she made the decision knowing exactly what would happen, but she had a whole coalition of people who were behind her. You know, not everyone's going to make that decision to go up the flagpole, but that doesn't mean you can't support that person. And what does that support look like? That's still showing up. It's not showing, it's showing up. But anyway, thank you so much. Well, it's called Erasure Agitation, and I'm just looking for a publisher. So there are a few things I need to tweak with my designer, but I'm hoping I can get it printed next year, but we'll see. Yeah, and then it'll be on Amazon or something.